I'm back, this time in high definition and surround sound. Not this time. We've got a problem that's pretty common, and every home mechanic should know how to diagnose this. It is when the car sits for a long period of time overnight, it will have a dead battery, completely dead battery in the morning or even just after a few hours. So, a couple things that could explain this. One could be it has a bad battery, and that is certainly not the case because the owner simply tried to diagnose it himself by, of course, replacing the battery, and at $80 when the problem still happened, he quickly realized that that's not the problem. And also it's possible that the battery may not be charging with the alternator, but again, the problem only happens when the vehicle's sitting overnight. So what that means is that something is drawing current from the battery even when the car is completely off. So this is known as parasitic amperage draw. And often it can be something very simple as not knowing that you've left a dome light on or something like that. A lot of times it's from hidden light bulbs that you don't see, like the trunk light is always on or the glove box light is always on. Of course, you don't readily see those. So you can check simple things like that. But more likely it's going to be something that's not going to be readily apparent. And I'm going to show you how to find what circuit is responsible for your parasitic amp draw that is draining the battery. All right, so the first thing I want to do is disconnect the negative cable from the battery. The test I'm going to show you also will work if you disconnect the positive cable of the battery. It doesn't matter. I always like disconnecting the negative cable because this way, if this terminal shorts out on some ground component or whatever, then no harm will be done. Obviously, if you have the positive disconnected and the negative connected, electrons leave out of the negative end and they will complete a path. So if you ground out somewhere on the frame or, God forbid, the computer with your positive terminal, it will range from making a nasty spark all the way to doing some serious destruction. So I'm really going to suggest undoing the negative terminal for this test. And the next thing I want to do is I'm going to get a volt ohm meter. Notice this one has 3 spaces. Hopefully yours does too, because you're going to need to be able to measure amps. It needs to have an amp measurement. If your volt ohm meter does not have that, then you are going to have to get one that has that capability. But right now we're going to just do a regular voltage test. I just want to look and make sure that the battery is fully charged before I do the test. So let's see if I can get out of your way there, and at about 12.5 volts we have a fully charged battery, so we're good to go. Now, the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to take this plug, the positive, out of its usual site and put it into the DC 10 amp slot, and then turn my dial to DC 10 amp. And we'll set this up here so you can see it. And what we're going to do is see how much amperage is being drawn from the battery. Now, at any given time, there's always going to be at least some amperage drawn from the battery, if nothing else, just to keep the clock running when the car is off and everything. So what we're looking for on a normal situation is we want to have, it depends on the model and how many accessories there are. Obviously there's a lot of accessories on some models, but it should be pretty much under 100 milliamps. Definitely if you have over 500 milliamps or like we're certainly going to see in this case more than an amp, then you definitely have a parasitic draw on some component. Either there's some light left on or there's some short circuit somewhere, but something is drawing the battery severely. Very seldom will you get a thing where it's like 150 milliamps and you're not sure. Generally in this situation, when you do this amp test, you're going to see at least an amp drawn, and you'll know right away that you've got an issue. So let's go ahead and do that. The way you do this is we're just going to complete the circuit using the volt ohm meter and measure how many amps are going through the circuit. So I'm just going to take this lead and put it to the battery and make sure it's nice and secure, which it's not, but it's going to be good enough, I think. Clamp is set on the battery there, and now I'm going to touch to this terminal and we're going to complete the circuit, and we see that we've got almost 2 amps right there. So we know that there is something that is drawing way too much power, even though everything on the car should be off. So now we need to find out what circuit is responsible for this problem so we can narrow it down. All right. Wow, that door opens really smooth. Very simple. The strategy here is I'm going to access this fuse panel, and don't forget there's usually also one in the engine compartment, and on some models there's even some on the passenger side. They can be all over the place. But the strategy here is very simple. What I want to do is pull fuses one by one until I see that the amperage draw is back to spec. Once I pull a fuse that drops it back to spec, that's how I know what circuit has the problem. Now, there's a couple challenges with that. The first one is an obvious one. Just by opening the door, I am going to draw probably a couple amps right there from the courtesy light. So there's a couple ways around this. One way is if I look around the door jamb, I might find the little button that when the door closes, it turns off the lamps and vice versa. So that's one way I can tape that button shut. The way I like to do it is I actually like to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Very often, the courtesy lamp could be the problem to begin with. So I'm going to look, and number 8 is the courtesy lamp. So I'm going to go ahead and just pull that fuse, and this does 2 things. It allows me to keep the door open, but also I'm going to go back to the meter and see if this fixes the problem. Back at my amp meter now, and of course I've got that courtesy lamp fuse pulled. So at this point I'm going to go ahead and take a reading here, and if we are significantly dropped, then we know that there is some issue with the courtesy lamp circuitry. And we see that we're right back to where we were before. So it's not the courtesy lamp system. But the good news is by doing the courtesy lamp first, I can leave that fuse out, and now I don't have to worry about leaving the door open while I check the other fuses. So what I think I'm going to do is get some long wires that I can feed my connection, so I'll have the voltmeter right next to me at the fuse panel. So when I pull the right fuse, I'll be able to see immediately that I've got the right effect. Obviously, there's a lot of fuses that you would have to pull one at a time, so you want to use a little bit of logic and rationality in which fuses to pull first that are most likely to cause the problem. So in this particular vehicle, one of the many things that it needs, the power window on the driver's side doesn't work. So I'm going to go ahead and do that fuse next. It's entirely possible maybe the motor is always engaged or short-circuited or something. That would totally explain, although I think it would be more than 2 amps. But that's a great place to start. If the car has any kind of aftermarket stereo system or anything, it's usually a pretty safe bet that if you go after the radio fuse, you'll find that that's where the parasitic draw is. So just some common sense stuff. I usually like to start with accessories more than anything else, and then doing things like fuel injectors or whatever generally won't yield the problem. So just a little common sense. But given the fact that this car has a problem with the power window, I'm going to go ahead and try that one and see what happens. What I did was I went ahead and I removed the power window fuse, and we're going to go ahead and repeat this test real quick, and we can see we're back to 1.8, so it is not the power window. So the next thing I want to do is I noticed that the on button on the radio is actually broken. Radio, very common one for this problem. So I'm going to do the radio fuse next. Not sure why the power button on the radio broken would cause the radio to be on all the time. Unless it's in accessory mode, the radio should turn off even if it was on when the key is out and the door closes. So not quite sure, but let's go ahead and do the radio fuse and see what happens. All right, radio is this one here. So we're going to pull that, and let's go see what happens. Okay, so with the radio fuse out, let's go ahead and try this again. And check that out. About 82 milliamps, which is totally reasonable. Now, just to be sure, what I'm going to do is go ahead and put that radio fuse back in and make sure that we get back up to 1.8 amps. Okay, radio fuse is back in, and we should see that we're back to 1.8 amps again, and we are. So that confirms that that is the circuit with the problem. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and maybe pull a wiring diagram, see what is going on with that circuit. And also, don't forget, I'm going to go ahead and reinstall my courtesy lamp fuse too, since we know that that circuit is not the issue. That is how to do a parasitic amp draw test. I hope you found this helpful. Almost forgot. One final note. Always remember to turn your meter off and take that positive and put it back where it came from. Otherwise, the next time that you do a volt reading and it's still in that position, you will blow the fuse on your meter. Don't ask me how I know that.